We're going to take a deeper look into obesity and metabolism. And the plan is to define some of these things that we've spent the last few weeks looking at, obviously discussing the impact of obesity and being overweight, impact on heredity, looking at some of the health risks, describing pediatric and childhood risk for overfatness and poor health, discussing criteria for assessing excess body fat. We're going to look at fat cell size, number, and normal cells, be able to describe the effects of weight gain and weight loss on what happens to the actual cell number and size, look at genetic factors and the different types of fat cells, outline 3 approaches to unbalance the equation that we all know exists for weight loss, be able to describe 4 characteristics of people who successfully maintain and prolong weight loss, and then summarize advantages of the different types of diets, ketogenic, high protein, very low calorie. Provide some rationale for physical activity, where that fits into the equation, intensities of activity with energy expenditure among sedentary individuals, and discuss why combining both activity and food restriction is really what's needed, and then look at different modes of physical activity. So we have a lot to go over in these slides, but I think it's going to kind of piece together everything we've already looked at. Look at some of the myths with spot reduction, and then diet and physical activity advice for someone who wishes to gain weight, which is the opposite of what we've been talking about. So when you look at the historical perspective, biblical scholars throughout history have preached against the ills of excessive food intake and sedentary living. Way back in time, Galen, which is one of he wrote many essays on excess fat is harmful to the body and makes people sluggish, disturbs the body's function, hinders movement, and then back in with the Hippocratic essays, he was the father of medicine. He discussed obesity is represented as a major health risk way before anyone really knew what obesity was. So his text conveyed pretty much the overarching belief that obesity deviated from the norm or ideal. So it's very essential for maintaining healthy balance in aspects of life. Other physicians wrote essays and virtues about the importance of walking and running and rope climbing, in addition to what activities such as bathing and massage and rest, and being able to understand lifestyle antidotes. So very old text gave us essays believing that obese individuals should be active, and this sense of food intake and activity level was way early. And even then in the 9th century, a little later, the practice of modulating food intake and the practice of theologians and philosophers about the rate of breath while eating and all of these crazy things were evaluated way back in time. So what we know is that our modern scientific era, we have no clear answer that exists between seemingly simple questions as why have so many people gained so much weight and fat, and what can be done to reduce the problem. An excessive gain in body fat results from complex interaction of genetic, environmental, metabolic, physiological, behavioral, social, and even perhaps some racial influences. We know that large numbers of individuals struggle to lose weight or simply just maintain body weight. We know that only 1/5 of Americans attempting to lose weight use the recommended combination of caloric restriction while engaging in increasing amount of physical activity. Those attempting weight loss often rely on harmful dietary practices, drugs, while ignoring sensible weight loss programs. So notwithstanding the upswing in attempts to lose weight, people throughout our industrialized nations are considerably more overweight than people of a generation ago. Obesity, unfortunately, remains an equal opportunity affliction despite this obesity epidemic that now afflicts all regions throughout the United States. This figure compares data that you've seen before, right? The National Health and Nutrition Exam Survey, looking at obesity prevalence, looking at the percentage of adults, and we have children, as well as the total number of obese children, adolescents, and adults in the U.S. who classify as obese. Current estimates place the combined number of both overweight and obese Americans nearly 140 million, which is 70% of the population, including 35% of college students. An unprecedented increase from only 56% back in 1982. This current trend continues. More than half of our Americans in most states will be obese by simply 2030. This is a very similar figure, and it's taking a look worldwide, contributing the rise of the onslaught of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, promoting the World Health Organization and the International Obesity Task Force to declare what we know as the global obesity epidemic. When you take a look at these countries, Yugoslavia and Greece have the largest percentage of obese women and men, which is defined of BMI exceeding 30, while Switzerland has the lowest. We know that obesity now ranks the second leading cause of preventable deaths in the United States. And, simply when you're looking at deaths from tobacco, exceeding deaths from HIV, illegal drug use, alcohol, motor vehicle injuries, suicide, murders, all of that combined. The total annual cost of treating obesity and overweight is $140 billion related to obesity accounts, approximating about 10% of the U.S. healthcare expenditures. This is another figure that depicts very powerful effects of excessive body weight in predicting survival at an older age. So overweight but not obese, non-smoking men and women in their mid-30s to mid-40s died at least 3 years sooner than those of normal weight counterparts, a risk just as damaging to life expectancy as chronic cigarette smoking. Obese individuals with a BMI 30 or larger, those are the red lines on there, can expect about 7-year decrease in longevity. Survival rates progressively increase as BMI decreases. Children experience an equally depressing situation because the prevalence of overweight in children, BMI greater than 95th percentile for age and sex, has attained very grim proportions, with the total reaching almost 13 million, or 17% of American youth between the ages of 2 and 19 classify as obese. So these are really alarming numbers. Pediatric obesity represents childhood's most common chronic disorder, particularly prevalent among poor and minority children. About 70% of obese youth possess multiple risk factors such as diabetes, elevated cholesterol, hypertension, risk for bone and joint disorders, social and psychological problems including stigmatization, poor self-esteem. Part of the rise in body weight relates to nearly 300% increase between 1977 and 1996 in the types of food that children are consuming from restaurants and fast food, as well as the upswing in soft drink consumption among young consumers. Excess accumulation of body fat or overfatness represents a very large heterogeneous disorder in which energy intake chronologically exceeds energy expenditure. The disruption in energy balance that often begins in childhood profoundly affects the likelihood of achieving adult obesity. For example, obese children at age 6 to 9 have a 55% chance of becoming obese adults, a risk that is 10 times that of children of normal weight. Simply stated, a child generally does not outgrow overly fat conditions. So middle-aged men and women invariably weigh more than college-age counterparts of the same stature. Between the ages of 20 and 40, Americans gain 2 pounds yearly for a 40-pound gain in body weight. Women tend to gain the most weight of about 14%, adding more than 30 pounds between the ages of simply 25 and 34 years of age. The degree to which we so-call creeping over fatness in adulthood reflects a normal biological pattern that remains very unclear. A general increase in energy intake has occurred over a 30-year period among adult Americans. Every man and woman now consumes an average of 445 more calories daily than what we did in 1970. This translates to, get this number, 162,790 additional calories per person yearly. That's a huge number, right? The most disturbing dramatic increase occurs with the consumption of added sugars. Most of this increase came from simply high fructose corn syrup. Right, glucose and other corn sweeteners. This figure shows that most current 2010 data from food consumption from different food sources expressed as calories a day for the average American. Flour and cereal products provide more calories daily than any other food group. right? This is revealing the typical American diet does not dovetail with the most recent MyPlate recommendations, which you all know what that looks like. As a percentage of total food intake, Americans overconsume meats by 17%, grains by 22%, while substantially underconsuming fruits by 60% and vegetables 40% and dairy products by 50%. Notable interaction between genetics and environmental makes it very difficult to quantify the role of each of these the obesity development. Research among twins, adopted children, and specific segments of the population attributes up to 80% of the risk of becoming obese to genetic factors. For example, heavier than normal newborns become fat adolescents only when the father, or particularly the mother, is overweight. The child has more than twice the normal risk of becoming an obese adult. Even for normal weight prepubescent girls, body composition and regional fat distribution relate to the body composition characteristic of both parents. So what this means is that one's genetic makeup does not necessarily cause obesity, but instead lowers the threshold for the development because of the impact of susceptibility of the genes. Research have identified key genes and specific DNA sequence variants that relate to the molecular cause of appetite and satiety that predisposes a person to gain excessive body fat. A more complete understanding of the genetic role in body fat accumulation requires identifying key genes and their mutations, including all of the relevant proteins that contribute to the chronic energy imbalance that we're currently seeing. This figure is looking at the inherited factors contributing to the variability in weight gain among individuals fed an identical the identical daily caloric excess, and can contribute to the tendency to regain weight that once was lost. So studies of individuals who represent 9 different kinds of relatives indicate genetic factors that affect metabolism and appetite determine about 25% of the total transmissible variation among persons in a percentage of body fat and total fat mass. So the larger percentage of variation of body fat status relates to 30% transmissible cultural effect, which is really the unhealthy expression of patterns of pre-existing genes. Human obesity links to the mutant gene that synthesizes leptin, right? So the leptin is derived from the Greek root of leptos, L-E-P-T-O-S, which means thin. So the crucial body weight regulating hormonal substance produced by fat and released into our bloodstream acts on the hypothalamus to affect how much one is eating, how much energy one is expending, and ultimately how much somebody weighs. This figure, this photo, the genetic model is showing us the predisposing, what we know is the OB gene, right? That OB gene normally becomes active in the adipose tissue and perhaps muscle tissue where it encodes and stimulates production of body fat signaling. So the hormone-like protein, which is that OB protein or leptin, which then enters the bloodstream. The satiety signal molecule travels through into the nucleus, and a collection of specialized neurons throughout the hypothalamus controls that appetite and metabolism and then develops soon thereafter birth. Normally, leptin is going to blunt, right, stop the urge to eat when the caloric intake maintains at ideal fat stores. Leptin may affect certain neurons in the hypothalamic region that stimulate the production of chemicals that suppress appetite and or reduce the levels of neurochemicals that stimulate the appetite. So this may be something you've learned before, but it's a really important thing to understand. We also want to take a look at racial differences in food consumption, physical activity patterns among cultural attitudes towards body weight to help explain the greater prevalence of nearly 50% obesity among Black women and 30% among white women. Small differences in resting energy expenditure, which we call REE, related to racial differences in lean body mass. 18 contribute to the racial differences. The racial effect, which also exists among children and adolescents, predisposes a Black female to gain weight and regain it after weight loss. On average, Black women burn nearly 100 fewer kilocalories daily during rest than Caucasian counterparts. The slower rate of caloric expenditure persists even after adjusting for differences in body mass and composition. 100-calorie reduction in daily metabolism translates to nearly 1 pound of fat gain each month. Daily calorie energy expenditure of Black women averages 10% lower than whites. Regular physical activity through either recreation or occupation can help to minimize weight and fat gain. The effects begins to thwart the tendency to regain lost weight and counters a common genetic variation that makes people more likely to gain excess weight. Maintaining a physical activity lifestyle contributes positively to the prevention and treatment of obesity-related health outcomes, independent of its effect on weight loss. Individuals who maintain weight loss show greater muscle strength and engage in more physical activity than the counterparts who regain that lost weight. Variations in physical activity alone accounted for more than 75% of regain of body weight. Such findings highlight the need to identify and promote strategies that we need to be increasing regular physical activity. Our current national guidelines by the Surgeon General and Institute of Medicine recommend that we all know a minimum of 30 to 60 minutes of moderate physical activity daily, endorsing that we all should be increasing to 80 to 90 minutes of physical activity, 6 to 7, or all preferably 7 days, to combat the obesity epidemic in the United States. We also can all affirm that individuals modify their daily routines to encourage more whole body movements while minimizing the most common relatively non-active sedentary behaviors. From age 3 months to 1 year, the total energy expenditure of infants who later become overweight averaged 21% lower than infants with normal weight gain. So for children ages 6 to 9 years, percent body fat inversely is related to physical activity level in boys, but not girls. Obese pre-adolescent and adolescent children generally spend less time in physical activity or engage in less intense activity than normal weight peers. By the time young girls attain adolescence, many do not engage in any leisure time physical activity. For girls, the decline in time spent in physical activity averaged nearly 100% among Blacks and 64% among whites between the ages of 9 and 10 and 15 and 16. By age 16, 56% of Black girls and 31% of white girls reported zero leisure time activity. So physical activity lifestyles we know lessen the normal pattern of fat gain in adulthood. For young and middle-aged men who engage in regular physical activity, time spent actively relates inversely to body fat levels. This is not surprising. Middle-aged, long-distance runners remained leaner than sedentary counterparts. Right? So this is important stuff that we know exists, but we need to make sure that we're making changes. Maintaining a lifestyle that includes a regular and consistent level of endurance activity attenuates but does not fully forestall the tendency to add weight through middle age. Sedentary men and women who begin an exercise regimen lose weight and body fat compared with those who remain sedentary. Those who stop exercising gain body fat relative to those who remain more physically active. This is a figure showing that, moreover, a proportionately exists between the amounts of weight change and activity dosing. So this figure is displaying the inverse association among distance runners and BMI and waist circumference for men in all age categories. Physically active men typically remain leaner than sedentary counterparts for each age group. Men who ran longer distances each week and weighed less than those who ran shorter distances. So the typical male who maintained a consistent weekly running distance throughout middle age gained only 3.3 pounds, and waist size increased 3/4 of an inch regardless of the distance run. Such findings suggest that by age 50, a physically active man can expect to weigh about 10 pounds more with 2 inches larger waist than he weighed at 20, despite maintaining a constant level of increased physical activity. So this helps us, this proclivity to gain weight and girth may relate to reduced levels of testosterone and growth hormone that induce age-related changes in physique and increase abdominal and visceral fat. To counter weight gain in middle age, one should gradually increase the amount of weekly physical activity to the equivalent of fast walking, jogging, or running to about 1.4 miles each year starting at the age of 30. What we know is that obesity represents a very unfortunate cause of preventable death in America. The combined effects of poor diet and physical activity caused approximately 330,000 deaths in the year of 2000, a 33% jump over 1990. Right, a decade earlier. If the body weight of Americans continued to increase at the current rate by 2020, where we are right now, we know 1 in 5 healthcare dollars spent in middle-aged Americans has resulted from excess body fat. Impaired glucose tolerance, overall diminished quality of life emerge even among obese children and adolescents. Hypertension, elevated blood sugar, postmenopausal breast cancer, and elevated total cholesterol along with low-density lipoprotein cholesterol heightens an overweight individual risk of poor health at any given level of excess weight. Increased loads on the major joints can lead to pain and discomfort, complications from osteoarthritis, inefficient body mechanics, and reduced mobility, causing more obesity. This is another figure showing the alarming rise in obesity among childhood and adolescents, requiring immediate interventions to prevent subsequent risk for disease as these children grow into adulthood. The figure is showing the percentile cutoffs for a 2-level procedure recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics to identify either overweight children, right, so BMI greater than the 95th percentile, requiring in-depth medical assessment, and those at risk of becoming overweight, which is the 85th to 95th percentile, requiring a 2nd-level screening, including family history and risk factor assessment. Considerable information exists regarding increasing levels of body fat and defined health risk in children, adolescents, and adults. Excessive body fat relates closely to the alarming increase in type 2 diabetes among children. For adults with diabetes, 70% are classified as overweight and nearly 35% as obese. All of these bullets on this slide you have seen. You're not surprised to the health risk of excessive body fat. Very systemic. Weight gain also increases risk for cancer of the breast, colon, esophagus, prostate, kidneys. Maintaining a BMI below 25 could prevent 1 of every 6 cancer deaths in the United States, or about 90,000 deaths yearly. 1/2 of the cardiovascular deaths and 1/3 of colon, endometrial, and breast cancer deaths are linked to overweight condition. Researchers followed a cohort of 82,000 female nurses between the ages of 30 and 55 years of age every 2 years from 1976 to determine whether their initial BMI modifies the relation between long-term weight gain or weight loss and hypertension risk. This figure shows us the relative risk for hypertension adjusted for multiple factors linked with hypertension in 3 groups stratified for BMI at age 18. For women in the 1st and 2nd BMI categories at age 18, weight loss at later years did not reduce hypertension risk. Weight gain after 18 markedly increased hypertension risk compared to women who maintained a stable body weight. So what determines this demarcation between normal body fat and excess body fat? This is what we spend our time in the lab looking at, right? What's the criteria we're using? So when we take a look at this, we are pretty much using statistical boundary norms of an average body fat percentage of about 1 plus or minus standard deviation for any given range. So applying statistical boundary norms for young adults To indicate excessive body fat, we would say men above 20% body fat and women above 30%. That is our estimation of body fat percentages for healthy people. The patterning of body's adipose tissue independent of total body fat alters health risk. We know in children, adolescents, and adults. So we know this as the apple or the pear, right? So the fat patterning, the central obesity, we know that as android obesity. You may know that as the apple versus the gynoid or the peripheral obesity, which is commonly classified as the pear. So as general guidelines, we often use the waist to hip girth ratios, and that waist hip ratio exceeds 0.80 for women and 0.95 for men. That tells us our increased death risk even after adjusting for BMI. Waist girth exceeding 47 inches in men and 43 inches in women is associated with approximately twice the likelihood of dying during the study period. Surprisingly, a larger waistline links to greater mortality for men and women regardless of the BMI levels. So going back to the waist circumference, very important. This figure is showing us those two types that I just mentioned of what we call regional fat distribution, right? Increased health risk from fat, where the fat is being deposited throughout the body. So excessive weight distribution in the abdominal area corresponds to high blood insulin levels. So that's what we know as that apple, the android. It also increases colorectal cancer. A waist girth that increases 36 inches in men and 32 inches in women nearly doubles the risk of cancer. BMI categories and waist girth measurements, again above 40 inches for men and 34.6 inches for women. Assessing a person's risk for health problems ranked from least risk to high risk. So when you're looking at that waist hip ratio, we're really looking at where that visceral fat lies. We know that we're going to have higher risk in the apple and slightly lower risk in the pear, but still are definitely not ideal. This table, this is showing us distribution and patterning of fat at different anatomic regions throughout the body, along with the BMI. So we have the waist girth and the BMI. So BMI remains significantly associated with death risk when the statistical analysis included either waist circumference or waist hip ratio. The authors of this study advocate the use of waist girth or waist to hip ratio, including a BMI, to assess death risk, particularly among persons with relatively low BMI. So researchers studied the cellular differentiation to determine why some fat cells become excessively large and abundant while others remain normal in size without increasing their number. It had been determined that either the conservation of energy or the expenditure of energy differed in the development of adult white adipose tissue and infant brown adipose tissue. Specific genes were identified that first were expressed in pre-adipocytes compared to mature fat cells. Once they identified, attention was focused on what actually happened to those cells. So what was going on with the transcription factors that so-called turned on, flipped the switch for those genes to start producing more fat cells. So we're looking at size, fat size. So fat cell hypertrophy, enlarging the size, and fat cell hyperplasia, which is increasing the number of fat cells. This is an interesting slide photo. In laboratories, a needle biopsy was done and extracted fat cells, and it measured the average fat content of the adipocytes in 3 different anatomic sites. So this figure is showing you adipocytes from the upper buttocks, and the person that upper buttocks was someone who was around about 90 kilograms, about 19% body fat. So that's kind of the size of the person these cells came from. And then they estimated the total adipocyte number was 23.3 billion. So what happened is over the next 28 years, a weight gain of about 3.2 kilograms, right? That creeping obesity we keep talking about presumably was accounted by the increase in total fat mass. So without increasing free fat mass, more likely related to the decline of fat mass with aging, if that makes sense. what is going on with those differences in cells. So the additional fat accumulation can probably be explained by increases in the size of the fat cells without actual fat cell proliferation. So from hundreds of turned on genes, right, where it got turned on, fat cell differentiation, what we call the AP2 gene became a good candidate for to appropriate the model to study what we call cell differentiation between brown cells, right, brown fat cells versus white fat cell growth development. So this research was back in the 1990s, originally identifying what we call peroxisomal proliferation activation receptor gamma, the PPARY. And they call this the master gene of white fat cell development. Subsequent research has now demonstrated that this human gene also serves these same functions. So from hundreds of turned on genes, fat cell differentiation and what we call that P2 gene became a very good indicator as an approximate model to study this differentiation